Welcome to another edition of Mornings with Matthew. I'm Matthew Tragesser, and joining me today are two FAIR employees. FAIR's Julia Post. Welcome, Julia.
Thanks, Matthew.
And also our brand new employee, Preston Huennekens, who works in our Government Relations Department. Glad to have you on today, Preston.
Happy to be here.
To begin today's show, we'll begin with a segment called You Won't Believe This.
What?
So in this segment, we'll talk about something that was misleading or highly controversial in politics for the week. So today we'll be talking about the highly contested citizenship census question that the Supreme Court recently heard oral arguments for. So there are a lot of angles and nuances with this issue, but I kind of want to go over what our organization thinks about this and, the advantages including this question brings to the nation, but also just for the census in general. So for those unfamiliar with this issue, every 10 years, a census is taken to count the nation's population and to determine the demographics of the country. So it helps us construct policies and just assess the people living in our country. We assess kind of the age, sex, race, demographic questions like that. So it's super instrumental for the country. So now the Trump administration wants to add a question about citizenship for the 2020 census. And it's gotten a lot of blowback, especially by people on the left, open borders advocates. And so there's been a lot of debate about this. So Preston and Julia, what are your initial thoughts about this? What are the advantages of adding the citizenship question to the 2020 census?
I say first that this isn't a remarkable change proposed by the administration. Every household was asked some form of this question up until 1950, and this question has been included in the American Community Surveys, which are sent out every year to a select group. So it's not unprecedented, and like you suggested, it will help, I think, the U.S. get a sense of what the composition of our foreign-born population looks like. It's projected in 2020 that 14% of the U.S. will be foreign-born. The last time we had a number that high was in 1910. And in 1910, in that year, we asked that question. So I think it'll be very helpful.
And I think one of the top problems with the census question is when you look at arguments that have been made in the past about Democrats particularly using the immigrant populations as a voting power and additional voting clout. When you look at where these people go when illegal immigrants tend to come into our communities, they go to cities in certain states. And when those people are counted in the census, if they're not being counted as illegal aliens, they're going to add to the overall population of the state, which is going to affect redistricting and the apportionment of seats in Congress. So they will effectively be using their illegal populations to gain more political power at the expense of states in the middle of the country that don't have as high illegal populations.
Right. And the one thing I don't understand is, many on the left continue to say, this will cause a chilling effect to illegal aliens if you include this question. They're not going to want to mark their citizenship status and then they just won't answer the survey at all, which could undercount the population numbers, and then that could obviously affect a lot of public policy decisions. But the one thing that people are forgetting is, you don't put your name on the survey when you answer the survey. It's anonymous. And also federal law protects the information in the census. So it's not just publicly available and people are going to hunt you down because you marked that you were here illegally. And I think that's one misconception that the media has not really addressed is, it's a very private survey.
And if that was the case, if there was this chilling effect, we would see that reflected in the ACS data, which we don't.
Right.
People still answer that.
So for our listeners out here, what is the ACS?
The ACS is a survey run by the Census Bureau that goes out to about 2% of American households every year. And it's kind of a mini census in a way. It's so the way that the Census Bureau's statisticians kind of come up with these models. And it also helps them kind of prepare for the big census every 10 years. So like I was saying, we already asked the citizenship question on that particular, on the ACS, and there's no chilling effect. People answer it truthfully, to the extent we're aware, answer it truthfully and answer it, no one's not filling it out, that kind of thing.
And I mean, I think there's just such a benefit to having the census question, because when you look at our research team, they have such a hard time collecting particularly state data on any kind of information regarding illegal populations in the country, because the states, possibly on purpose, don't collect this kind of data. And when you're looking at that as far as apportioning federal funding to these states and to what they're, money that is being allotted from taxpayer funds, you're looking at really an unfairness to the rest of the American people when we're not collecting data that we could be getting.
Right. Well, I mean, the federal funding, that is granted to states annually is based on population. So, states like California with huge illegal alien populations, they're most likely receiving larger amounts of federal funding. I think almost every year, $1 trillion in federal funding is allocated to states based on population. So it's crucial we know who's a citizen and not a citizen, and, should, funding be allocated more to states that have more legal residents or U.S. citizens.
The biggest problem is that it incentivizes these states to allow more illegal populations, and it incentivizes the proliferation of sanctuary cities in those states because they want to bring people in. They want them to be counted when they feel like it, when it gets them more federal funding or if it gets them more representation in Congress. But then when it comes to, possibly benefiting the American people, then all of a sudden the roadblocks go up and, hey, we don't want to count these people as whether, what their status is. So I think that's very telling as to what they're trying to do by manipulating this data.
Right. And, what I don't understand, again, is, you have Senator Kamala Harris tweeting over the weekend that basically adding this question is a quote-unquote blatant attempt to suppress immigrant families from being counted in our nation. And then she also added that Congress should act to ensure the integrity of the census is protected. I mean, does she not see the advantages that, adding this question can bring to not only, people living in the states, but also, for government decision-making?
Right.
And the senator's point doesn't make a whole lot of sense because we already ask whether or not people are immigrants by asking them if they're foreign-born.
Right.
That's been a question on the census for as long as I think it's been issued. So, asking if you're foreign-born and then following it up by asking if you're a citizen is not stretch.
That's a great
Absolutely.
point. Yeah, I think, and also, she's clearly not thinking about this in terms of the growing crisis on the border, but, framing it as, we're not encouraging immigrant families to come forward and be a part of our community is not really the conversation that we even should be having. The conversation we should be having is, do the American people have a right to know who's in their country and who's coming in? I mean, if these people just continue to come in and the government's not holding them accountable to answering for themselves whether or not they're here, it just allows the problem to grow.
Right. And get this. So other countries, they include this question on their, annual census or however, how many censuses they have. But Spain, Mexico, Canada, Ireland, these are other countries that include the citizenship census question. And even the United Nations recommends it. And so it baffles me that again, it's something that there's so much opposition to.
And I think for the president's purposes and the administration's purposes, it's a crucial question that we really need to be asking if we're going to move forward and ever fixing some of the problems that we have in our immigration system.
All right, so those are some great points that Julia and Preston made there, and the Supreme Court actually won't have to make a decision until late June, so we'll keep you guys updated on that. Moving along, we'll move to a segment called The Weekly Number. In this segment, we'll be discussing a number that I think is super crucial for the immigration debate and for our listeners out there to understand. So this week, I've chosen the number 415,000. So this number represents the number of individuals that were suspected of overstaying their short-term visitor visas in fiscal year 2018. So this is a huge number. And to put this in perspective, 415,000, that's the size of a large city like Cleveland or New Orleans. So it's a large number of people. And this is just in 1 year, one fiscal year. So Preston, what are your thoughts on that number? And do you see it dropping anytime soon?
So the good news that we got out of the visa overstay report is that there were less suspected overstays than last year, which is a good sign. But as we all know, people that overstay their visas make up a huge proportion of the illegal population in the United States. In some ways, it is, it's pretty easy to just come in on a tourist visa and never leave. And one, figure from that report that stands out to me is the amount of students and exchange visitors who are overstaying. About 3.7% of all students admitted on F visas, on exchange people who come in on J1 visas, are overstaying. And, that's a really big population. And those are also people who likely want to remain in the U.S. after having studied here for a number of years.
Right. Now, Julia, I know that the Trump administration has proposed this new proposal to hopefully curb down this number. I'm not sure if you saw that recently, where officials will target nations that have overstay rates greater than 10%.
Right. So I'm really happy to see the Trump administration moving on this particular issue and immigration reform. I know they focus a lot on the wall. I know that was his original campaign promise, was building the wall. The wall is definitely an important aspect, but sometimes I fear that it draws attention away from the other loose points in our immigration system, and then we focus all on the wall because it's cool, but we don't talk about something like visa overstays, which might sound like less sexy in a news headline than build the wall, but it's also a really important part that we need to be focusing on. And what the president's really doing is, he's saying, hey, other countries, you need to respect our laws. Your people, they're coming here for opportunities, educational opportunities or experience. Maybe they will apply to become citizens. Maybe we'll provide that opportunity for them. But for them to come here and basically move in without being invited to or without legally having the authority to really undermines our immigration system. And it's an insult to our country, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. For our listeners out there, administration officials will target nations that have overstay rates greater than 10%. So this includes Afghanistan, Chad, Nigeria, and a bunch of other African nations. But it's good to see that they're trying to crack down on this. And according to Pew Research, 45% of illegal aliens in our country right now came through visa overstays. So that's a pretty sizable number, especially if this occurs annually.
And I think that reflects that the border wall is important, again, but that it's not the only flood point where people are coming in, and that the visa overstays are a huge problem. But I think, that hopefully targeting these nations and incentivizing them to really enforce the laws that we're proposing when their people come here, because it's a great opportunity for them to have their people coming here learning in our education system. And I guess their hope is that those people will come back and then help them to grow their own communities. That's a great program if it works, but if they all just stay here, take jobs here that they weren't really authorized to come in and take, that creates a problem here and also a brain drain in their own countries. So that really doesn't help anyone.
So that was definitely an alarming figure to see. 415,000 short-term visitor visa overstays in fiscal year 2018. We're hoping that Congress can act better on this issue and help decrease this number. For our next segment, we'll transition to guest perspectives, where I had the pleasure to interview Peggy Davis, who is a cattle rancher near the U.S.-Mexico border. Peggy has seen firsthand the effects of illegal immigration in her own backyard, and let's take a listen to that interview now. And so going off of that, I mean, you've lived around this area for, decades now. And you still have, politicians, especially on the left, or you have, journalists who are in New York or Boston, very far away from the border, who've never been to the border. They keep saying that this crisis is manufactured. There really is no real crisis. Can you explain to our listeners here, if it is a crisis or not? And, I think it's really good that we're getting a perspective from someone who actually lives near the border and who's seen, these surges in illegal immigration levels for decades now.
Right. Well, when you have the experience of seeing the traffic and how it ebbs and flows over the years, and that the drug cartels really decide who comes across the border. Who do they let, and who do they not let come across this border? So we've got, the advantage of history to see that. But it is an emergency. It has been an emergency for a number of years. And that's why people in the heartland of America are having problems now. You have to look at it that way. If they would have listened to us with these problems 20, 25 years ago, you wouldn't have the problems that you have now in the interior of the United States. It is a crisis, and what people don't understand is because the border is so vast and the terrain is so different all along the southern border, and where it's really critical at one point. It'll be soft in another, but it changes back and forth. It moves. It's like a river that's flowing, looking for an easy place to go, and that's what water will do. Well, that's what these people do. They look for the path of least resistance, and somebody in South America is bringing them up here and transporting them. And I've seen a lot of migrants in my life here, and those people that are coming in for asylum, they are being clothed and fed, and they do not look like your average starving migrant.
Right.
That's not what's coming.
And I'm glad you brought that up, because I actually have some figures here. This is from the Washington Examiner. So they have calculated that in the Yuma sector, which is one of the 9 sectors along the southern border,
Yes.
that diapers, food formula, and basic medical care will cost $1.2 million just for this year. And so that's just 1 out of 9 sectors along the border. And it's really interesting to see, because, like you said, they're getting very, very good healthcare, medical care, and for some, it's the first they've ever seen, because they're coming from rural highlands in Guatemala, from very impoverished areas, and you have to question where this money is coming from, and is it only going to increase as family units are becoming the popular type of migrant coming across now. It's not just young single males; it's family units.
And the drug cartels are ruthless. You've got to understand that culture. People in the United States don't understand cartel narco culture.
Mm-hmm.
They are not very soft-hearted. They are ruthless, and they will use a child just like anybody else. And 10 years ago in Mexico City, the abduction rate of children was crazy.
Mm-hmm.
They were stealing children then. They steal them now, kidnap them, and put them into these groups. And, these are our children. We're seeking asylum. And a lot of those children do not belong to those people.
Right.
It's just a brutal culture that is, we're let me back up a minute. We are always condemned because we're not soft-hearted enough, and they take the cake on that. It's just unbelievable.
It really is.
What they do in their own culture.
So if you had 30 seconds with the president right now, President Trump, what would you ask him to do to help improve this crisis? Is it the wall? Is it our immigration laws? Is it more Border Patrol agents? In your mind, from someone that's living close to the border for many decades now, what would you think would be the best solution for the president to implement, or what would be your call to action to him?
Wow, it's a multifaceted problem, but off the top of my head, he was right on point to shut down the border.
Mm-hmm.
I know why he doesn't. I know why he's giving them time. My senators won't even agree with that, because they get pressure from the local communities near the border, and it's the economy. It'll wreck the economy. There's just this big fear of wrecking the economy.
Right.
But in my amateur opinion, it's a short-term solution for a long-term gain. If you put the pressure on Mexico, they need to take some responsibility for this too. And they need to stop those people coming through. And the only way to do that is to shut down that border and put the pressure on them. And I don't think it would take very long for them to get the point. But I understand why he's doing what he's doing.
I would totally agree. It's a shame that Mexico is not doing more to help with this immigration crisis. I really wish Trump would place more pressure on them. He has over the course of his presidency, but still, we're still seeing record numbers of migrants come to the southern border, and we can only hope that the president puts even more pressure on the Mexican government to cooperate.
Well, we all know that if he had a little help from Congress, it would make things a whole lot easier. They could fix this problem in a week if they wanted to. There's not been the will in Washington to do it. There still isn't, and I'm not talking about the president. I'm talking about Congress. And because they aren't willing to help, and because they really want open borders, a lot of them, it's not going to change. He's not going to be able to put a stop to it. I also would urge him. Here's another thing that I'm trying to think of things that he could personally do.
Mm-hmm.
I think he could put pressure on increasing Border Patrol employees, new hires, because they're understaffed. They're even under their minimums right now.
Right.
And if he could put pressure on and asking for people coming back, soldiers coming back from Afghanistan, for example, that they could fast track them right into the Border Patrol. We've been asking for that for years. Talked to Senator McCain about that personally. I've talked to Martha McSally about it personally. I just think that would be really helpful if they could increase and get people there who have been trained to do so and could do it pretty quickly.
Unfortunately, that's all the time we have this week. Tune in next week for another edition of Mornings with Matthew. For more immigration news, check out fairus.org.